Hey everybody, this is a piece by Russell Jacoby titled What is Conformist Marxism? Let's read Russell Jacoby's Wikipedia page. Russell Jacoby was born in 1945. Russell Jacoby is an American academic and a professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, an author and a critic of academic culture. His fields of interest are 20th century European and American intellectual and cultural history, specifically the history of intellectuals and education. At these points, his work, however, also crosses into the sociology of knowledge. As of 2013, he was professor in residence, an untenured position at the UCLA Department of History, and had taken emeritus status by 2022. A documentary, Velvet Prisons, Russell Jacoby on American Academia, premiered in 2013 and played at many festivals, including the Humanity Explored Film Festival, the Davis International Film Festival, and Columbia Gorge Film Festival. Russell Jacoby was born in New York City and educated at the University of Chicago and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received a doctorate in 1974 from the University of Rochester. His parents were Jewish and active in left-wing politics, shifting their politics only in later life. His books include Social Amnesia, a critique of contemporary psychology, published in 1997. The text, What is Conformist Marxism, which I'm reading now. Dialectic of Defeat, Contours of Western Marxism, published in 1981. The Repression of Psychoanalysis, Otto Fenechel and the Political Freudians, published in 1983. The Last Intellectuals, American Culture in the Age of Academe, published in 1987 and republished in 2000. Dogmatic Wisdom, How the Culture Wars Divert Education and Distract America, published in 1994. The Bell Curve Debate, History, Documents, Opinions, 1995. The End of Utopia, Politics and Culture in the Age of Apathy. Picture Imperfect, Utopian Thought for an Anti-Utopian Age, published in 2005. Bloodlust, On the Roots of Violence from Cain and Abel to the Present Era, published in 2011. On Diversity, The Eclipse of the Individual in a Global Era. Intellectuals in Political and Academia, Culture in the Age of Hype, published in 2022. Such as other articles and reviews in American Historical Review, Grand Street, The Nation, Los Angeles Times, London Review of Books, The New York Times, Harper's, and elsewhere. So here we go. Section 1. Quote, so much worse for the facts, end quote. With these words of Fichte, Lukács closed the first draft of, quote, What is Orthodox Marxism? I think you can find a reading of Orthodox Marxism on, I can't remember how to pronounce her name, Adriesta's Revolt or Adriesta's Revolt or whatever. You can find it on there, I think. To the skeptical and perhaps to the sympathetic, the words are outrageous. One second. Sorry. I was seeing if there's anything that was like a summary of what is Orthodox Marxism. Anyway, Marxism is not contradicted by the facts. The facts are duplicit, or at best mute. To quantify, classify, categorize facts is to capitulate to facts. Quote, truly orthodox dialectical Marxists paid little attention to the so-called facts, end quote. Footnote. Georg Lukács, What is Orthodox Marxism and Tactics and Ethics in Political Writings, 1919 to 1929, published in 1972. End footnote. The obverse is plainer and more convincing. The facts confirm Marxism. The large events, as well as the small, prove the truth of the theory. The Russian and Chinese revolutions, imperialism, the development of the working class, and so on, all demonstrate the continuous validity of Marxism. Marxism is compelling precisely because Marxism is accurate, and finally, because Marxism is successful. Marxism works. The strength of the working class, as well as the victory of several revolutions, leave little doubt. Success is the proof. Success. This is the rub. How does one evaluate success? The 17th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 1934 announced that the party has, quote, triumphed everywhere. According to Wikipedia, the 17th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks, popularly known as the Executed Congress, as the majority of those present at the Congress were arrested or executed during the Great Purge, was held from the 26th of January to the 10th of February 1934. The Congress was attended by 1,225 delegates with a casting vote and 736 delegates with a consultative vote, representing 1,872,488 party members and 935,298 candidate members. Back to the text. Stalin declared that socialism was now, quote, the sole commanding force, end quote. For this reason, the official account dubbed this meeting the, quote, Congress of the Victors, end quote. Footnote. See History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course, edited by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union Bolsheviks in 1938. End footnote. Several decades later, in 1956, Khrushchev indicated how the victors fared. Quote, of the 139 members and candidates of the party's Central Committee who were elected at the 17th Congress, 98 persons, i.e. 70%, were arrested and shot, The same fate met, the majority of the delegates to the 17th Party Congress. Of 1,966 delegates, 1,108 were arrested on charges of revolutionary crimes, i.e. decidedly more than a majority, End quote. Footnote. Khrushchev's secret report to the 20th Congress, published in Bertram D. Wolfe's Khrushchev and Stalin's Ghost. End footnote. I'm going to look that book up. Yeah, I'm not seeing any descriptions for it. Back to the text. The banal truth. Today's success is tomorrow's failure. Everybody wants a winner. Nobody likes a loser. That nothing succeeds like success is true, not only for bourgeois society, but bourgeois society's critique, Marxism. Marxists too want to win, or, at least, side with the winners. Orthodox Marxism has chased after success, and this hunt has paralyzed Orthodox Marxism's critical nerve, past and present. Prior to World War I, the German Social Democrats exercised hegemony by virtue of their strength and electoral victories. After their moral and political collapse in World War I, the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks assumed this role. With the undoing of the Russian Revolution, dated anywhere from Kronstadt 1921 to the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Chinese Revolution and Maoism step in. Since each worked, each promised to deliver the magic formula for success, the final argument flung by the Leninists at the non-Leninists is that Lenin succeeded. The non-Leninists were not only wrong, they failed. The lure of success and the sweet smell of victory fuel orthodox Marxism. Marxism-Leninism, or Marx-Lenin-Mao Zedong thought, exudes the nonsense of how to succeed. This is the source of their perpetual attraction. Unlike anarchism, syndicalism, council communism, or whatnot, they have proven themselves. They offer victorious revolutions to be emulated. Everything else pales before the fact of history. The adherents of orthodox Marxism extol and promote the victorious revolutions and parties as the route to success, until their shortcomings or failure become too obvious, then another is adopted. I'm going to copy that down. That's a good one. Sorry, forgive me for stopping like this, but just want to make sure I get this one down. Okay. The ex post facto element damns this Marxism to apologetics. Marxism degenerates into public relations for revolutionary movements. Marxism turns critical only at last resort. Marxism may suffice for philosophy to attain wisdom at dusk, but Marxism must commence Marxism's flight earlier. To condemn the failures after the verdict is too late. The issues are complex. The future events of history are beyond anyone's grasp. History provides no refunds, guarantees, or insurance policies. The misappraisal of a successful revolution, or the revolution in the making, the premature celebration, the mistake, the retraction, and so on, form the very marrow of the human experience in history. For this reason, the charge that a mistake has been made, or belatedly corrected, is itself compromised. It assumes a position outside of history, where there are no choices, failures, mistakes, or successes. The charge implies that it is better not to choose, and it retreats to the tired wisdom that history is bunk and vanity, or it hides behind academic knowledge, too cautious to think and judge. If this is true, it is also insufficient. This rejoinder slips into the c'est la vie, the truth I am. I don't know, I am the truth. Let's see what that means. C'est la vie.
C'est la vie. C'est la vie.
C'est la vie. That's life. Okay, that's life is what it means. It's pronounced c'est la vie. I was pronouncing it wrong. This rejoinder slips into the c'est la vie, that's life attitude, that excuses indifferently all theories and commitments. It is no sin to be wrong, but it is no virtue to be consistently wrong, and this is the question which orthodox Marxism provokes. Footnote. See the, quote, balance sheet that Fernando Claudine draws of the record of the Comintern, as well as his important chapter, The Crisis of Theory, in The Communist Movement from Comintern to Common Form, published in 1975. And I'm not seeing any descriptions for this book. So, yeah. And footnote. History is assembled out of a series of discrete mechanisms. If one proves defective, another is always available. This approach is immunized against criticism by continually shifting its object, Last year it was Maoism, this year the prison movement, next year the working class. A minor example, Charles Betelheim, a respected French Marxist, resigned from the Franco-China Friendship Association May 1977, signifying his break with post-Maoist China. Footnote, see Charles Betelheim, Letter of Resignation, and The Great Leap Backward, published in Monthly Review, 1978. See the responses, especially by Arthur McEwen, Comments on China Since Mao, published in Monthly Review, 1979. I have a piece by Charles Betelheim on the channel. For many years, Betelheim enthusiastically praised the Cultural Revolution and Maoism. Now Betelheim believes that the campaign against the, quote, Gang of Four commenced a, quote, great leap backward. The ease and facility with which the advances of the Cultural Revolution and Maoism are being undone suggests to Betelheim that the seeds for the reversal were planted earlier. Something must have been amiss with the Cultural Revolution itself, which allowed the Cultural Revolution to be so rapidly set aside. As a side note, you should check out some of the things I have on Maoism on this channel from Lauren Goldner and Simone Lay. Yeah. And indeed, Betelheim tells us, quote, when we look back and analyze what has happened since 1965 to 66, we can say that this change in the relation of forces was already apparent in the first months of 1967, ... End quote. Betelheim. Betelheim goes on to identify some features of this change: the introduction of coercion, displacement of mass participation, rise of sectarianism, and so on. This may be fine and good, but why do we learn this only now? The answer is obvious. While Betelheim states the changes were, quote, already apparent, end quote, in 1967, they were not apparent to Betelheim, and many others for another 10 years. The reasons that Betelheim now adduces for the, quote, great leap backward, end quote, were presented as successfully overcome in his 1973 book, Cultural Revolution and Industrial Organization in China. I'm going to look this book up. I don't know if I said this, but I have a piece by Betelheim on the channel about state capitalism in the USSR. The brief little description on Amazon says, discusses the ideological foundations of Mao's Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution and its effect on traditional social and economic structures in the socialist class struggles. And it was originally published by Monthly Review. Back to the text. Betelheim wrote then, in 1973, quote, that through discussions and struggles involving millions of workers and vast sections of the population, a new road was opened up in the struggle for socialism, ... It constitutes a decisive and permanent achievement, as decisive and permanent as any scientific or social experience which discovers new processes or new objective laws, end quote. Nor is this the first time that Betelheim identified permanent scientific advances that turned out to be neither permanent scientific or advances. Betelheim's analysis of the transition from capitalism to socialism, as well as the Russian Revolution, were both wanting. In the mid-1960s, Bettelheim defended Stalin's ideas on the law of value in a socialist society against, quote, Che Guevara. Footnote. See Bettelheim, there's an article in French that I can't read. And there's a book by Bettelheim, La Transition vers l'économie socialiste. I think that's translated in English, so maybe it wasn't at the time. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not seeing any descriptions for it. It's apparently, I think it's published as by Monthly Review, of course, as a dual book with, I guess it has pieces by Sweezy and Bettelheim. The problems of countries which occupy an intermediate position between capitalism and socialism are undoubtedly among the most important in the modern world. The experiences of the Soviet Union have now been supplemented by those of Eastern Europe, North Korea, and North Vietnam, and perhaps most important, China and Cuba. A large technical literature has grown up on the economics of these transitional societies, but the leading ideas and concepts of the analysis have been pioneered nowhere so well as in these pages. The several articles of the discussion began in October 1968 when Paul M. Sweezy, co-editor of Monthly Review, published an article on the current problems of socialism. The article led to an exchange of views between Sweezy and Charles Bettelheim, director of studies at the School of Higher Studies in Social and Economic Science, the Sorbonne. The second part of the book consists of 3 articles from Monthly Review on the same general subject matter: Lessons of Soviet Experience, The Lessons of Poland, and the Transition to Socialism. Despite diverse origins and times of writing, the pieces in this book maintain a unity of topic. They concern the economic, social, and political aspects of the attempt to create a new society after the governmental power of the old has been destroyed and replaced. Central to the entire discussion is the possibility that the policies adopted by the new governments under the stress of economic and political difficulties may result in the creation of a new capitalism in, quote, statist forms. Okay, so that's the description of the book on the transition to socialism. Back to the text. The rejoinder by, quote, Che, decried Bettelheim's mechanical and undialectical approach. Footnote. A brief summary of Che's criticism of Bettelheim can be found in Michael Louvie's The Marxism of Che Guevara. Again, it should be noted that Michael Louvie is on the conservative end of international Trotskyism, being an orthodox Trotskyist, and called all these charming anti-working class authoritarian dictatorships, worker states, way past any point where they could reasonably be called so, or even considering revolutions, quote revolutions, where the working class was not the active agent in those struggles at all as working class revolutions, necessarily because they nationalized property. But let's see what the description of Michael Louvie's book has to say. In this seminal exploration of Che Guevara's contributions to Marxist thinking, Michael Loewy traces Che's ideas about Marxism both as they related to Latin America and to more general philosophical, political, and economic issues. Now revised and updated, this edition includes a chapter on Guevara's search for a new paradigm of socialism and a substantive essay by Peter McLaren on Che's continued relevance today. Loewy portrays Guevara as a revolutionary humanist who considered all political questions from an internationalist viewpoint. For him, revolutionary movements in Latin America were part of a world process of emancipation. Loewy considers especially Che's views on the contradiction between socialist planning and the law of value in the Cuban economy, and his search for an alternative road to the, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, of the Stalinist and post-Stalinist Soviet bloc. Che's varied occupations, doctor and economist, revolutionary and banker, agitator and ambassador, industrial organizer and guerrilla fighter, were expressions of a deep commitment to social change. This book eloquently captures Che's views on humanity, his contributions to the theory of revolutionary warfare, and his ideas about society's transition to socialism, offering a cohesive, nuanced introduction to the range of Guevara's thought. Back to the text. End footnote. Several years later, in 1969, Bettelheim debated the same issue with Paul Sweezy. Footnote. Charles Bettelheim's article on the transition between capitalism and socialism, with a reply by Paul Sweezy, published in Monthly Review, 1969. The text and others are in Bettelheim and Sweezy on the transition to socialism, published in 1971. End footnote. In 1974, Bettelheim admitted that his writings in the period 1962 to 1967 on the transition from capitalism to socialism were, quote, not satisfactory. The problem was that until 1956, Bettelheim had taken the Soviet Union as a, quote, model for revolution. He's frequently referenced in, I don't know frequently, but he's referenced in, like, Cornelius Castoriadis's works in France in the late 1940s and early 1950s as one of the more, sophisticated Stalinists. Or Castoriadis discusses Bettelheim as one of the more sophisticated Stalinists of the period. Sophisticated, doesn't very mean much when you're talking about Stalinists. Anyway. Where am I? However, the problem persisted for another 10 years. Only the, quote, lessons of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, quote, induced Bettelheim to, quote, modify very seriously the terms of my analysis, end quote. Bettelheim. Class struggle in the USSR, first period, 1917 to 1923. Yeah, I don't really have like a good description of this. End footnote. Hence, Bettelheim began a major reevaluation of the Russian Revolution. In Class Struggle in the USSR, 1974, two additional problems emerge here. Bettelheim's serious modification of the evaluation of Russia is not very serious. Footnote. For a fine analysis, see Ralph Miliband, Bettelheim and the Soviet Experience, published in New Left Review, 1975. Sorry, I was looking for an abstract for that piece, but I don't see it. See also Carmen J. Serrani's review in Socialist Review. Back to the text and footnote. Bettelheim repeats the parenthesis past question mark end parenthesis quasi-official Chinese position on the Russian Revolution, and now that the Cultural Revolution has proved to be imperfect, Bettelheim may have to reevaluate it. Consequently, Bettelheim's reevaluation of the Russian Revolution may have to be reevaluated, and so on. Footnote: for another Bettelheim debate where he demonstrates his mastery of the Althusserian lingo, see preface to the French edition by Charles Bettelheim in Aguirre Emmanuel's Unequal Exchange. End footnote. Is this gloating? To stand utterly outside the fray is hardly virtuous. It purchases purity by selling off critical intelligence and commitment. And to enter into the fray inevitably yields mistakes, including major mistakes. Quote, there are no innocents in politics, end quote. Footnote. See Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Humanism and Terror. The description of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Humanism and Terror, says, first published in France in 1947, Humanism and Terror is a vital work of political philosophy by one of the leading French philosophers of the 20th century, attempting to understand what he called the, quote, dislocated world that followed immediately after the Second World War, including his own divided France. Merleau-Ponty asks a fundamental question: how did Marxism and humanism come apart? Through a fascinating reading of Arthur Koestler's famous novel, Darkness at Noon, an allegory on the Stalinist show trials and purges of the 1930s, Merleau-Ponty weighs up the cost of a regime of permanent revolution and false confessions. Merleau-Ponty's profound and controversial point, however, is that the purges were the inevitable outcome of abandoning crucial subjective elements of Marxist theory of history, with the result that, quote, humanism is suspended and government is terror, end quote. As we again confront the reality of authoritarian political polarization and curtailing of human freedom, the dislocated world brilliantly depicted by Merleau-Ponty in Humanism and Terror sends a powerful and articulate message that continues to resonate today. Back to the text and footnote. Yet neither is everyone equally guilty. Distinctions can be and must be made. Political intellectuals who are perpetually on the hunt for successful revolutions betray their ethos: success. The issue is not the failings of an individual, but a style and procedure that eviscerates Marxism. Success is peddled till success fails, and then success is peddled again in a new form. At any single instant, the success appears more than convincing. The facts are on its side, while the critics command only theories and harping objections. The Russian, Chinese, and Cuban revolutions silence critics by their very existence and success. Debray's 1967 Revolution in the Revolution enthusiastically prescribed the Cuban model of revolution for all of South America. The description for Regis, I don't know, Debray, which is Debray's book Revolution in the Revolution, says, an explosive classic published to mark the 50th anniversary of Che Guevara's death and of its first publication. Revolution in the Revolution, is a brilliant pragmatic assessment of the situation in Latin America in the 1960s. First published in 1967, it became a controversial handbook for guerrilla warfare and revolution, read alongside Che's own pamphlets, and remains fully as important as the writings of Guevara. Lucid and compelling, it spares no personage, no institution, and no concept, taking on not only Russian and Chinese strategies, but Trotskyism as well. The year it was published, Debray was convicted of having been part of Guevara's guerrilla group and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He was released in 1970 following an international campaign which included appeals by Jean-Paul Sartre, André Malraux, General Charles de Gaulle, and Pope Paul the Sixth. Back to the text. 10 years later, the situation is sobering. The success is non-existent. Gerard Chelon titles his recent analysis Guerrilla Inflation, the Foucault Theory as a Theory for Failure. Debray himself hardly disagrees. He calls his pamphlet, quote, a book of the moment, end quote. Well, Verso certainly doesn't think it's a book of the moment. Footnote. Gerard Chaliant, Revolution in the Third World, published in 1978. Let's look that book up. I'm not seeing anything on that book. It seems like its full title is Revolution in the Third World, Myths and Prospects. Yeah. No, there's no description of it. End footnote. Footnote. See Debray's self-critical comments in A Critique of Arms, Volume 1, published in New York, 1977. Yeah, I don't think I'm seeing anything for this book as well. It seems to be out of print. End footnote. Some of this can be characterized as, quote, third worldism, the pursuit and promotion of third world revolutions by intellectuals of North America and Western Europe. Yet the style has worked as effectively and perniciously within the industrial nations. The black movement, urban guerrillas, prison movement, and the working class itself have all been the objects of instant mythologizing. Not the least of the ills of orthodox Marxism is its wake of demoralization and cynicism. Hopes perpetually raised and dashed take their toll. If its more public figures can switch objects without losing a beat, others have graver difficulties. Who can transfer their loyalties without doubt from the Soviet Union to China, to North Korea to Albania, or from the student movement to the black movement to the third world to the working class? The committed leech away. The old anti-communist, quote, God that failed, end quote, becomes the weary, quote, gods that failed, end quote. For many Marxists, an old routine has been refurbished to account for perpetual mistakes, self-criticism. I want to read the Wikipedia, actually, for criticism and self-criticism real quick. Criticism and self-criticism, parenthesis, Marxism-Leninism, is a philosophical and political concept developed within the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism. The concept will be a major component of the political philosophy of the Chinese Marxist leader Mao Zedong. The concept of self-criticism is a component of some Marxist schools of thought, primarily that of Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, and Marxism-Leninism-Maoism. The concept was first introduced by Joseph Stalin in his 1924 work, The Foundations of Leninism, and later expanded upon in his 1928 work, Against Vulgarizing the Slogan of Self-Criticism. The Marxist concept of self-criticism is also present in the works of Mao Zedong, who dedicates an entire chapter of the Little Red Book to the issue. Accordingly, many party members who had fallen out of favor with the nomenclatura were forced to undergo self-criticism sessions, producing either written or verbal statements detailing their ideological errors and affirming their renewed belief in the party line. History, Soviet Union. According to David Priestland, the concept of politically enforced, quote, criticism and self-criticism originated during the 1921-24 purges of academia within the Soviet Union. This would eventually develop into the practice of, quote, criticism and self-criticism, end quote, campaigns, in which intellectuals suspected of possessing counter-revolutionary tendencies were publicly interrogated as part of a policy of proletariatization. Joseph Stalin introduced the concept of self-criticism in his 1924 work, The Foundations of Leninism. Stalin would later expand this concept in his 1928 article, Against Vulgarizing the Slogan of Self-Criticism. Stalin wrote in 1928, quote, I think, comrades, that self-criticism is as necessary to us as air or water. I think... What? No. I'll be out. No, I'm doing something. Sorry. I'll be out. He would later expand this concept in his 1928 article Against Vulgarizing the Slogan of Self-Criticism. Stalin wrote in 1928, quote, I think, comrades, that self-criticism is as necessary to us as air or water. I think that without self-criticism, our party could not make any headway, could not disclose our ulcers, could not eliminate our shortcomings, and shortcomings we have in plenty. That must be admitted frankly and honestly, end quote. Joseph Stalin. For Stalin, self-criticism was not opposed to, quote, self-criticism was not supposed to be, quote, temporary and transient, end quote, but a, quote, indispensable and permanent weapon in the arsenal of Bolshevism, end quote. Sorry about that. My dad wanted me to watch something from the television. However, Stalin posited that self-criticism, quote, dates back to the first appearance of Bolshevism in our country, end quote. Stalin stated that self-criticism was needed even after obtaining power, as failing to observe weaknesses, quote, makes things easier for their enemies, end quote. And that, quote, without self-criticism there can be no proper education of the party, the class, and the masses, end quote. Vladimir Lenin wrote in One Step Forward, Two Steps Back of 1904 that the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party engages in, quote, self-criticism and the ruthless exposure of their own shortcomings, end quote. Lenin further discussed the idea in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder of 1920. Quote, frankly, admitting a mistake, ascertaining the reasons for it, analyzing the circumstances which gave rise to it, and thoroughly discussing the means of correcting it, that is the earmark of a serious party, end quote. Lenin again further elaborated at a later date, 1922, that, quote, all the revolutionary parties have perished so far, perished because they grew conceited, failed to see where their strength lay, and feared to speak of their weaknesses. But we shall not perish, for we do not fear to speak of our weaknesses, and shall learn to overcome them, end quote. Stalin. According to the official history of the October Revolution and Soviet Union produced under Stalin, the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, the concept is described briefly in the 12th chapter. Quote, in order to be fully prepared for this turn, the party had to be its moving spirit, and the leading role of the party in the forthcoming elections had to be fully ensured. But this could be done only if the party organizations themselves became thoroughly democratic in their everyday work, only if they fully observed the principles of democratic centralism in their inner party life, as the party rules demanded, only if all organs of the party were elected, only if criticism and self-criticism in the party were developed to the full, only if the responsibility of the party bodies to the members of the party were complete, and if the members of the party themselves became thoroughly active. End quote. The history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course. Following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, successor to Soviet premiership Nikita Khrushchev would reaffirm the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's ideological dedication to the concepts of criticism and self-criticism in the conclusion of the 1956 speech before the 20th Party Congress, while also denouncing the policies and actions of Stalin. New section, People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong provides a significant focus on the idea of self-criticism, dedicating a whole chapter of the Little Red Book to self-criticism. Mao saw, quote, conscientious practice, end quote, of self-criticism as a quality that distinguished the Chinese Communist Party from other parties. Mao championed self-criticism, saying, quote, dust will accumulate if a room is not cleaned regularly. Our faces will get dirty if they are not washed regularly. Our comrades' minds and our party's work may also collect dust and also need sweeping and washing, end quote. Mao. Mao saw the timing of self-criticism as important also, writing that, quote, do it in good time, don't get into the habit of criticizing only after the event, end quote. Mao. Mao advocated, quote, active ideological struggle, end quote, in the form of self-criticism while warning, quote, we must not become complacent over any success. We should check our complacency and constantly criticize our shortcomings, end quote. Mao. Mao said, quote, inner party criticism is a weapon for strengthening the party organization and increasing its fighting capacity, end quote. However, Mao warned against criticism degenerating into personal attacks, quote, the method of correction is to help party members understand that the purpose of criticism is to increase the party's fighting capacity in order to achieve victory in the class struggle, and that should not be used as a means of personal attack, end quote. Reading this shit is like so fucking laughable. Just knowing the history of what these people actually did in their lives and like the things that they say is hilarious. In the People's Republic of China, self-criticism called Ziwo Pipan or Zhan Tao is an important part of Maoist practice. Mandatory self-criticism as a part of political rehabilitation, common under Mao and ended by Deng Xiaoping, is known as a struggle session in reference to class struggle. As General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping has partially brought back the practice of self-criticism. The first of his party's education programs on selected themes dealt with the mass line and required cadres to make self-criticism before their subordinates and to solicit critique from their subordinates. The Central Committee's 2016 guidelines on intra-party life in the new situation also encouraged self-criticism. New section, Vietnam. Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh made numerous references to the importance of self-criticism within the Vietnamese Communist Party. In 1956, Ho Chi Minh critically assessed the Communist Party as having leaders who did not practice self-criticism, and that criticism from the lower levels of the party was also lacking. Cambodia. In democratic Kampuchea, self-criticism sessions were known as Rien Sot, meaning, quote, religious education, end quote. In his memoir, The Gate, Francois Bizot recalls observing the Khmer Rouge engaging in frequent self-criticism to reinforce group cohesion during his imprisonment in rural Cambodia in 1971. Quote, several evenings a week, every evening it didn't rain, the guards gathered for a collective confession. Duch, Kang Kak Yu did not take part. I was a privileged witness to these circles, where they would sit on the ground under the direction of an elder. Military homilies alternated with simple repetitive songs. Quote, "Comrades," began the eldest, quote, "let us appraise the day that has passed. In order to correct our faults, we must cleanse ourselves of the repeated sins that accumulate and slow down our beloved revolution. Do not be surprised at this," end quote. Quote, "I said," was the first one, quote, "should have replaced the rattan rod today, the one north of the first shelter, with which we used to dry clothes. I have done nothing about it, ... on account of my laziness," end quote. The man presided over the session nodded with a frown, though not severely, only meaning to show that he knew how hard it was to combat inertia. So natural in man when he is not sustained by revolutionary convictions. He passed wordlessly on to the next man, indicating who this should be by pursing his lips in his direction. End quote. A quote's from Francois Bizot. North Korea. North Koreans are required to engage in Sanghwal Chonghwa sessions in which they confess to wrongdoings, transgressions, and deviations from Kim Il-sung's 10 principles for the establishment of a monolithic ideological system. They are required to attend self-criticism sessions from the age of 8. Members of the ruling Korean Workers' Party can be dismissed if they do not attend sessions for longer than 3 months. Inmates at North Korean Kwalliso camps are required to engage in self-criticism sessions, which often lead to harsh collective punishments for entire work units. The practice was introduced in 1962 during a series of ideological disputes with the Soviet Union. Outside the communist bloc, French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser wrote essays in self-criticism focused on the issue of ideologically correcting ideas expressed in his prior works, most prominently For Marx and Reading Capital. The American New Left Revolutionary Organization, whether underground, dedicated a chapter of their work, Prairie Fire, to self-criticism of their prior revolutionary strategies. Likewise, the German Red Army faction discussed the issue of self-criticism in their publication, The Urban Guerrilla Concept. Thank you for that detour. Back to the text. For many Marxists, an old routine has been refurbished to account for perpetual mistakes, self-criticism. Louis Althusser developed this into a fine art and an effective marketing strategy. As an art, it neatly absolves the past mistakes, makes way for new mistakes, and infers that the critics are spiteful and malicious for harping on the past. Who wants to criticize those who criticize themselves? As a commercial strategy, it is marketed by the engineers of the planned obsolescence of thought. Each theoretical innovation is fabricated out of defective parts and is designed to break down or be recalled. The intellectual and book buyer turns into a perpetual customer insofar as he or she is compelled to buy the latest work, which replaces the preceding work. Althusser invented not only theoretical practice, but pioneered in its malpractice. First, Althusser argued that Marx definitely broke with Hegel. Several years after this argument, Althusser confessed, quote, "I must admit that I have given a much too abrupt idea of this thesis, ... end quote. Footnote, see Louis Althusser, Lenin and Philosophy. End footnote. It also turned out that in his notion of Marx's, quote, epistemological break, end quote, I, ... made 2 mistakes, end quote. It was not epistemological nor a break. He also erred in reading Capital, the book, calling philosophy, quote, a theory of theoretical practice, end quote. Footnote, see Louis Althusser, Essays in Self-Criticism. End footnote. This mistake was not simply, quote, terminological ambiguity, but one of an error in the conception itself, end quote. He also mistakenly concluded that, quote, philosophy is a science, end quote. Later, Althusser discovered that, quote, philosophy is not a science, end quote. Footnote. See Althusser Essays. It's probably Essays in Self-Criticism. End footnote. Althusser also forgot about class struggle in For Marx and Reading Capital, quote, this is certainly the biggest mistake I made, ... end quote. Althusser Essays. So, I'm going to look up these books. Lenin and Philosophy by Althusser, which is published by Monthly Review. It looked like it might have also been published by Verso. It says, quote, today we're in a position to return to Althusser's work in a new way and make a new assessment of it, end quote. Writes Frederick Jameson in his introduction to this new edition of Althusser's Lenin and Philosophy. No figure loomed larger than Althusser in Marxist thought in the West during the 1960s and 70s, the decades in which the Soviet model was discredited in the West and new avenues opened up in Marxist philosophy and politics. Althusser stood out for his attempt to define a Marxist philosophy that was rigorous, scientific, and revolutionary. In the process, he set new standards of argumentation for Marxist theory. As Jameson shows in his introduction, the essays that had so massive and fertile an influence in those decades continue to speak to us today. From these essays, there emerges a conception of Marxism as something more and other than a philosophy, whose, quote, concepts are also forms of practice, so that one cannot simply debate them in a disinterested philosophical way without the uncomfortable intervention of practical positions and commitments, end quote. This classic work covers the broad range of Althusser's interests and contributions to philosophy, economics, psychology, aesthetics, and politics. It includes his major essay on ideology and ideological state apparatuses. This path-breaking analysis of ideology has inspired a range of recent approaches to this field, which remains central to our time. Lenin and Philosophy also contains Althusser's essay on Lenin's study of Hegel, an essay titled Freud and Lacan, Althusser's letter on art, and Saramonini, Painter of the Abstract. The book opens with a 1968 interview in which he discusses his personal, political, and intellectual history. This makes me feel good about all my typos and errors. Verso Books has essays in self-criticism listed as essays on self-criticism. The description says, Essays in Self-Criticism contains all of Louis Althusser's work from the 1970s. It is composed of 3 texts, each of which is in a different way presents elements of self-criticism. The first is Althusser's extended reply to the English philosopher John Lewis. In it, he, for the first time, discusses the problem of the political causes of Stalinism, which he argues should be seen as the consequence of a long tradition of economism within the Second and Third Internationals. The second major essay, written soon afterwards, sets out Althusser's critical assessment of his own philosophical work in the 1960s, including the extent and limits of his, quote, flirtation with structuralism. The book ends with an autobiographical study of Althusser's intellectual development from 1945 to 1975, given on the occasion of his reception of a doctorate at the University of Picardy. The political thought of the, quote, new Althusser is presented to English readers in a special introduction by his pupil, Graham Locke, which considers at length the lessons it sees in Soviet experience for contemporary communism. Back to the text. The list, if honest, is hardly enviable, nor is it exhaustive. Footnote. While defenders of the faith maintain that, quote, North American resistance to the work of Althusser and his colleagues is ideological, end quote, says Terry Eagleton in Clio 7, 1978. Many cogent critiques of Althusser have appeared, including English ones. Top of the pile is E.P. Thompson's Wild and Extraordinary, The Poverty of Theory, published in 1978. This reached me during the final stages of writing this manuscript, and consequently too late to be fully considered or utilized here. A fine discussion can be found in the review by Brian Singer of Rancière's La Leçon du Althusser, published in Telos 25. I'm going to look this up. The description for this article says Jacques Rancière has made his theoretical debut when, under the Althusserian umbrella, Rancière published a long essay in the 1965 edition of L'Île La Capitale. The essay was later omitted from the 1969 edition. Why? It has been suggested that Rancière's contribution was particularly vulnerable to a critique written by André Glucksmann. As such, its omission was part of a, quote, premeditated partial withdrawal in order to narrow tactical flanks, end quote. This is true. There was a tactical retreat. However, André Glucksmann was not the only person who criticized L'Île La Capitale. There was the leadership of the French Communist Party who viewed Althusser's heterodoxy with increasing alarm. It seems like it might have just been in the introductory chapter that they just kind of copied and pasted it as an abstract. Doesn't really tell us anything about this piece. I think I have something by Brian Singer on Castoriadis on this channel. Back to the text. I think that translates in English as Lessons of Althusser. Althusser's lesson. The description of Althusser's lesson by Jacques Rancière says, Jacques Rancière's first major work, Althusser's lesson appeared in 1974, just as the energies of May 68 were losing ground to the calls for a return to order. Rancière's analysis of Althusserian Marxism unfolds against this background. What is the relationship between the return to order and the enthusiasm which greeted the publication of Althusser's reply to John Lewis in 1973? Had to explain the rehabilitation of a philosophy that had been declared, quote, dead and buried on the barricades of May 68. What had changed? The answer to this question takes the form of a genealogy of Althusserianism that is simultaneously an account of the emergence of militant student movements in the 1960s, of the arrival of Maoism in France, and of how May 68 rearranged all the pieces anew. Encompassing the book's distinctive combination of theoretical analysis and historical description is a question that has guided Rancière's thought ever since. How do theories of subversion become the rationale for order? Back to the text, we're still looking at the footnote here. Other criticisms of Althusser include Raymond Aron de une sainte famille de la hauteur, published in Paris, 1969. Excuse me. The description for this Aron book is titled Imaginary Marxism from One Holy Family to Another. And the description says, now that the ideologies that had history and its promises as the horizon have folded their banners, Marxism is reintegrating its place among philosophies. This is exactly what Raymond Aron invited us to do some 30 years ago in this critique of the existentialist and structuralist holy families. We must, he said, put Marx back in his true place, that not of the radiant future of the world proletariat, but of a movement of Western philosophical consciousness. Back to the text. Also, the article by Pierre Villard, Marxist History, A History in the Making Towards a Dialogue with Althusser, published in New Left Review in 1973. I don't think I'm seeing, this is available, I don't think I'm seeing any abstracts for this article. Norman Garris, Althusser's Marxism, published in New Left Review in 1972. Alex Kalinikos' book, Althusser's Marxism. The description for Alex Kalinikos of Cliffite Trotskyist fame, Alex Kalinikos of Cliffite Trotskyist fame, or Cliffist, if that sounds less polemical. Alex Kalinikos places Althusser's work in the context of the two main traditions of Marxist philosophy, Engels and the orthodox, quote, dialectical materialism of the Second International, Lukács and the Hegelian Marxism of the 1920s. Kalinikos provides an introduction to the entire range of Althusser's ideas and traces, for the first time in English, their development and transformation. The result is an attempt to judge Althusser not simply as a philosopher, but as a Marxist. Back to the text. And the review by Tom Good in Telos 30, winter 1976. The abstract for this article by Tom Good, which is a review of Althusser's Marxism by Alexander Kalinikos, or Alex Kalinikos, excuse me. Due to the usual problems of translation, there's a considerable time warp regarding Althusser's published works. For critics who have followed the great Althusser controversy in French may have long since dismissed him, a new, quote, problematic is created by the more recent English publication of his books. There is then a need for a book which provides a critical assessment of Althusser for those who will now be reading him for the first time in English. Kalinikos' work is promoted by the publisher's blurb as the first book-length study in English of the ideas of the French communist philosopher. Back to the text. And finally, Miriam Glucksmann, Structuralist Analysis and Contemporary Social Thought, published in 1974. The description of Structuralist Analysis in Contemporary Social Thought, a comparison of the theories of Claude Lévi-Strauss and Louis Althusser, published in 1974. Its description says, The primary concern of this book is to investigate whether or not structuralism constitutes a distinctive framework in the social sciences. The author focuses on two major structuralist thinkers, Louis Althusser and Claude Lévi-Strauss. She analyzes and compares the structures of their theory and places them within the context of their respective discipline. Dr. Glucksmann began working on this book at a time when structuralism was at the height of its popularity in France and was thought to be a homogeneous alternative to bourgeois sociology. The progress of her study implicitly reflects the developments and divergences within structuralist thought that have emerged since then. In particular, she examines the differences between the political and philosophical thought of Althusser and Lévi-Strauss, which have become increasingly manifest. And the table of contents for this book says 1. The approach to structural and structuralist theory. 2. Meanings and uses of the term structure. 3. Claude Lévi-Strauss. 4. Louis Althusser. 5. Structuralist epistemology. 6. Conclusion, the structuralist problematic. Okay, so back to the text and footnotes. Excuse me for all those digressions, but I like to look up book descriptions. The list, if honest, is hardly enviable, nor is the list exhaustive. Moreover, what Reich said of Freud, even where he was wrong, he was right, can be said in the inverse of Althusser, even where he is right, he is wrong. Althusser represents a Marxism that is forever wrong or right too late. To explain Althusser's multiple miscalculations, he reaches for an alibi beyond approach, history. The irony is missed. Althusser and his followers have dedicated themselves to slaying the dangerous dragon of historicism. Historicism threatens the autonomy, rigor, objectivity, and finally the success of Marxism. For Althusser, historicism is a Hegelian corruption of the science of Marxism. Footnote. See the chapter Marxism is not Historicism in Reading Capital. That's in particular that Marxism is not a historicism is a chapter in the essay, Althusser's essay in that book, The Object of Capital. That particular chapter is, in fact, on this channel. Back to the text, or should be end footnote. Yet Althusser justifies all his mistakes by the fact that they were committed at a particular time and place, as if there could be some doubt about this. In Althusser's jargon, the quote conjuncture, quote, the exact balance of forces, ... at any given moment, end quote, is the universal excuse for errors. From the glossary of For Marx with, quote, corrections and interpolations, end quote, by Althusser. For Marx is where Althusser fleshes out his idea of the epistemological break. I'm pretty sure, at least, that's what the content of that book is. The fetish of indicating the exact time when they wrote, rewrote, and corrected their manuscripts characterizes all the Althusserians. This furnishes the gloss of precision, while anticipating a revision of the theory when the, quote, conjuncture, end quote, changes. Nikos Palantzis closes his book, Fascism and Dictatorship, melodramatically. Quote, given the aim of this book, I prefer to give this conclusion a date, Paris, July 1970. This book is Fascism and Dictatorship, the Third International and the Problem of Fascism by Nikos Palantzis, translated by Judith White with a foreword by Dylan Riley, is published with Verso. The description says, a compelling analysis of fascism, replete with insights into the authoritarian movements and states of our time. The resurgence of the far right across Europe and the emergence of the, quote, alt-right in the U.S. have put the question of fascism urgently back on the agenda. For those trying to understand these forms of politics, there is no better place to start than fascism and dictatorship. The unrivaled Marxist study of German and Italian fascism. It carefully distinguishes between fascism as a mass movement before the seizure of power and what it becomes as an entrenched machinery of dictatorship. It compares the distinct class components of the counter-revolutionary blocs mobilized by fascism in Germany and Italy, analyzes the changing relations between the petty bourgeoisie and big capital in the evolution of fascism, discusses the structures of the fascist state itself as an emergency regime for the defense of capital, and provides a sustained and documented criticism of official Comintern attitudes and policies towards fascism in the fateful years of the Versailles settlement. Fascism and dictatorship represents a challenging synthesis of factual evidence and conceptual analysis, a standard bearer of what Marxist political theory should be. Back to the text and footnote. So we're back to the text. Footnote. See Nikolaos Palantzis, Fascism and Dictatorship, published in London in 1974. For good critical appraisal, see Ansan G. Rabenbach, Palantzis and the Problem of Fascism, published in New German Critique. Might be able to find an abstract for that article. I don't see any abstract for this piece, for this review. Also see Martin Plaut, The Problem of Positivism in the Work of Nikos Palantzis. The description of the what's his name? Martin Plaut's The Problem of Positivism in the Work of Nikos Palantzis says, Jesus Christ. This document discusses the work of Nikos Palantzis and examines some of his key concepts by considering their origins in the work of Althusser and Bachelard. It notes that for Althusser and Bachelard, science requires an existential effort to overcome the mind's natural tendencies towards imagination and reverie. The document aims to critically examine Palantzis' categories by exploring their foundations in Althusserian thought in order to develop an adequate critique of Palantzis' theoretical coherence and positivism. It notes Habermas's critique of latent positivism in Marx, and how this becomes explicit in Althusser, who equates Marxism with the natural sciences. Back to the text. See also Salvador Giner and Juan Salcedo, The Ideological Practice of Nikos Palantzis. There's no abstract for this. Okay, so end footnote. Quote, to understand these essays, end quote, Althusser tells us in the introduction to For Marx, quote, and to pass judgment on them, it is essential to realize that they were conceived, written, and published, in particular ideological and in a particular ideological and theoretical conjuncture, end quote. Althusser suggests that the, quote, exceptional situation, end quote, in which his essay on Lacan was written explains why it has to, quote, either be corrected or expanded, end quote. End quote. Or he suggests that the, quote, exceptional situation, end quote, in which his essay on Lacan was written explains why it has to, quote, either be corrected or expanded, end quote. The evil is not in the appeal to history. Rather, history becomes an insurance policy for perpetual theoretical malpractice suits. The theory or theorist is never wrong nor ever reconceived. The guilt resides in the historical process, the conjuncture. In this way, orthodox Marxism immunizes itself. If it is always wrong or too late, the fault lies elsewhere. Althusser's response to one of his critics, John Lewis, indicates his achievement. See if there's anything for... Wikipedia says John Lewis lived from 1889 to 1976. John Lewis was a British Unitarian minister and Marxist philosopher and author of many works on philosophy, anthropology, and religion. John Lewis's father, a successful builder and architect, came from a Welsh farming family and was a very devout Methodist. Young John Lewis's social and political views clashed with those of his father. Their quarrels eventually led to John Lewis's father disinheriting him. Back to the text. Althusser chastises John Lewis for ignoring the historical situation in which For Marx was written, and then goes on to award himself a badge for courage and perspicuity. Quote, Mr. Lewis never talks about this political history, In For Marx, that is in 1965, I was already writing about Stalin, end quote. Footnote. Althusser Essays. I don't know if I said footnote or end footnote. Footnote, end footnote. So back to the text. Some 30 years after the Moscow trials, or 10 short years after Premier Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin shocked the world, Althusser was, quote, already criticizing Stalin. Althusser dreams he heads the theoretical parade, while tidying up years after the procession has passed him by. If the category of success needs re-scrutiny, so must failure. Neither success nor failure can be accepted as a blank fact. Success or success's absence is only one factor in the evaluation of a politics. We do not condemn the collaborators with Nazism because they picked the losing side, nor do we condemn the Spanish loyalists and Republicans because they lost. The history of the opposition to orthodox Marxism, council communism, dissident currents, and so on, is a history of failure, let there be no doubt. Yet it is not the less valuable. Failure proves nothing except who lost. This is often forgotten. No one likes losers. The history of revolution is usually presented as a string of victories, blemished by some setbacks and defeats. Rarely does one find Marx's own honesty. Marx wrote following the revolutions of 1848, quote, with the exception of a few short chapters, every important part of the annals of the revolution from 1848 to 1849 carries the heading, Defeat of the Revolution, end quote. Marx, Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, published in New York, 1964. One moment. One second. Sorry, I was going to look up the Wikipedia for Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. Fuck it, I'm still gonna do it. I'm on that path anyway. You know. Oh, fuck it. Sorry, I'm having too much trouble here. Shit. Okay, so the Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, was a set of articles written by Karl Marx for the newspaper Neue Rheinische Zeitung in 1850. The works were collated and republished in 1895 by Friedrich Engels. In these works, Marx analyzes the class issues and the economic relations which drove forward the social and political upheavals which took place in France in 1848. Marx focuses extensively on the argument that the conflict was not between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, but between different factions within the bourgeoisie. Specifically, he identifies conflicts between the industrial bourgeoisie, whose wealth and income are dependent upon the production and sale of goods, and the financial bourgeoisie, whom he identifies as bankers and stock market speculators. Marx identifies a political system where the individual is responsible for the development of public policy and the direction of public funds were the same individuals whose investments stood to be affected by these decisions. The result of this, Marx claims, was that public policy was manipulated for the sake of self-enrichment, given the example of extensive railroad projects being developed with public funds under the direction of legislators, who were also the main investors in these endeavors. Marx asserts, however, that while this situation was deemed intolerable to the industrial bourgeoisie, they were not in any position to take serious action against it. The industrial bourgeoisie still occupied a comparatively privileged position within society and government, and this fact, Marx argues, placed them in essentially the main camp of the financial bourgeoisie. Where Marx identifies the change in the situation that made the public revolt possible is in the set of financial crises further afield that had deleterious effects on the economic situation in France. Specifically, he identifies a set of crop failures in 1845 and 1846, and then a more general economic crisis which crippled England in the late 1840s. This crisis saw a wave of bankruptcies and factory closures throughout Britain, and it was in the midst of the aftershocks that this crisis sent across the European continent, Marx asserts, that the February Revolution took place. Marx asserts in these works that England, in that time, was setting the tone for bourgeois society in general, and blames this on the nature of the trade imbalances which then existed. Marx paints a picture of France exporting most of its consumer goods to England, while England exports most of its consumer goods further abroad. In the same way, Marx interprets the crises which affect England afterwards going on to affect the continent. Thus, Marx claims the general economic crisis in England led to a general economic crisis in France, and that this crisis was the cause of the revolution in February 1848. This prompts Marx to demonstrate why no such revolution occurred in England, and for this Marx offers the explanation that England was more thoroughly industrialized. England, Marx claims, needed no revolution because the industrialists already constituted such a great power, socially and politically, that they were able to confront the runaway power of speculative finance directly. France, however, was still far more heavily agrarian, while the industrialist class in France, though wealthy and powerful in its own right, did not wield sufficient power to carry through such a confrontation. It was only in the aftermath of the above-mentioned economic crises that the industrial bourgeoisie found themselves forced to align themselves with the agrarian classes against the financial bourgeoisie. Thus Marx concludes that in spite of the proletarian character and slogans of the revolution, the proletariat were used mostly as a prop, and that as soon as the new republic was established, the proletariat were more or less ejected from the circles of power. Marx goes on to describe how this use of the proletariat as a prop to dethrone the financial bourgeoisie on behalf of the industrial bourgeoisie left the bourgeoisie so disillusioned and alienated as to fall into support for Louis Bonaparte, a man whom Marx speaks of very disparagingly. He argues that Bonaparte's lack of character was central to his popularity, as he was able to signify different things to different constituents and therefore build a broad base of support among groups that, according to Marx, share few mutual goals and interests. Finally, Marx draws together the analyses of the political upheavals in France and the economic crises triggered originally in England and spreading outward to the continent, and from these analyses builds the argument that these upheavals in France, which seemed like a grand political shift in one nation, marked only minor change within the superstructure of a social and economic system which was multinational in character. Okay, so thank you for that detour. I apologize for it taking me forever to fucking find it. I was seeing if there was a description of it in from the German. Anyway, or Marx wrote some 15 years later, summarizing the intervening period, quote, "If then there had been no solidarity of action between the British and the continental working class, there was, at all events, a solidarity of defeat," end quote. Marx, inaugural address of the International Workingmen's Association. End footnote. End footnote. Outside Marxism, the same issues have surfaced, although not in the same form. In historical and sociological studies, controversy has flourished for years about the autonomy and resistance of various social formations. American blacks, working class, Jews, and so on. Evaluations differ as to the degree of independence and resistance within the oppressive environments of slavery, concentration camps, and bourgeois society. Interpretations tend to fall into two types. One stresses autonomy and relative success at resistance. Another stresses the converse, the power and ability of the establishment to repress or incorporate an opposition. The issues are emotionally and finally politically charged, and this is the point. A politics governs and fuels this debate. A left tends to elevate the advances in autonomy of the underlying class or group, and the right extols the power or genius of the establishment. To be sure, the politics is often implicit, but for this reason it is so much the more potent. It is never questioned and congeals into a dogma. The left always and everywhere finds advances of the subaltern groups. As a dogma, it might be better than most, and it does seem to rest on a self-evident proposition. Victims in history resist. They are also subjects of history, yet it also draws upon the myth of success, an upbeat vision of past and future conflicts. An examination of the strength of the establishment is dismissed as reactionary. Analysis of social relations which induced identification and not independence and resistance is precluded. It is the task of a left to always find victories and successes. Is it the task of a left to always find victories and successes of the oppressed? Question mark. Not only does this tacit logic turn mythological, but it ill serves its subject by minimizing the density and complexity of the oppressive social relations. That the oppressed were terrorized by terror conveys no insult. That they sold out so as to eat and live suggests no dishonor. The urge to people the desert of history is public relations for the moguls who have wasted it. I'm not exactly sure what that last sentence means, but it's a well-written sentence. The urge to people the desert of history is public relations for the moguls who have wasted it. The configuration of these debates testifies to the same pressures at work inside Marxism. The inclination to present the struggle as upward and successful. This has been the tendency of Marxism in all its terrains. To be sure, for the recent historical and sociological studies, as well as for Marxism, the provocations have never been lacking. To argue that there was little resistance to slavery, as Stanley Elkins did, or to Nazi extermination, as Bruno Bettelheim and Hannah Arendt did, or to bourgeois power, as working class studies did, was received as an insult, and the insult was doubled when it was further argued there was not only little resistance, but complicity and cooperation. I'm going to look some of these people up. Stanley Elkins. Wikipedia says Stanley Elkins lived from 1925 to 2013, was an American historian best known for his unique and controversial comparison of slavery in the United States to Nazi concentration camps, and for his collaborations in a book and numerous articles with Eric McKittrick regarding the early American Republic. They together wrote the book The Age of Federalism, on the history of the Founding Fathers of America. Stanley Elkins obtained his BA from Harvard University under the GI Bill Scholarship and his PhD in history from Columbia University. Elkins first taught at the University of Chicago, but spent most of his career as a professor of history at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he raised his family and eventually retired. And now the person I wanted to look up is Bruno Bettelheim. And then I have some footnotes to look up. Wikipedia says Bruno Bettelheim lived from 1903 to 1990. Bruno Bettelheim was an Austrian-born psychologist, scholar, public intellectual, and writer who spent most of his academic and clinical career in the United States. As an early writer on autism, Bettelheim's work focused on the education of emotionally disturbed children, as well as Freudian psychology more generally. In the U.S., Bruno Bettelheim later gained a position as professor at the University of Chicago and director of the Sonia Shankman Orthogenic School for Disturbed Children, and after 1973 taught at Stanford University. Bettelheim's ideas, which grew out of those of Sigmund Freud, theorized that children with behavioral and emotional disorders were not born that way and could be treated through extended psychoanalytic therapy, treatment, and rejected the use of psychotropic drugs and shock therapy. During the 1960s and 1970s, Bruno Bettelheim had an international reputation in such fields as autism, child psychiatry, and psychoanalysis. Some of Bruno Bettelheim's work was discredited after his death due to fraudulent academic credentials, allegations of patient abuse, accusations of plagiarism, and lack of oversight by institutions and the psychological community. Back to the text. Footnote. Elkins. See Stanley M. Elkins, Slavery, 3rd edition, Chicago, 1976, 1st edition, 1959. Sorry. I'm trying to find the best. There's a book by Stanley M. Elkins titled Slavery, A Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life. And the description says, this 3rd edition of Stanley M. Elkins' classic study offers 2 new chapters by the author. The first, Slavery and Ideology, considers the discussion and criticism occasioned by this controversial work. Elkins amplifies his original purpose in writing the book and takes into consideration the substantial body of critical commentary. Elkins also discusses a prediction on the course of future research and discussion. The table of contents says, an introduction, slavery is a problem in historiography, the old debate, the problem of, quote, new viewpoints. Book 2, or Section 2, Part 2 of the book is called Institutions and the Law of Slavery. The chapters are Institutional Breakdown in an Age of Expansion, The Dynamics of Unopposed Capitalism, Slavery in Capitalist and Non-Capitalist Cultures. Part 3, Slavery and Personality, Personality Types and Stereotypes, the, quote, African Culture argument, Shock and Detachment, Adjustment to Absolute Power in the Concentration Camp, 3 Theories of Personality, Mechanism of Resistance to Absolute Power. 4. Slavery and the Intellectual, Institutions and Insights, Intellectuals Without Responsibility, Sin, Guilty Innocence, and Reform. The Transcendentalist is Abolitionist. The Abolitionist is Transcendentalist. Choices. Postscript, Slavery, Consensus, and the Southern Intellect. Slavery and Ideology, the 2 Arguments on Slavery. And an appendix, Essay on Materials and Method. Back to the text and footnote. Footnote. Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is because it's a fucking enormous Wikipedia entry. Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil, is a 1963 book by the philosopher and political thinker Hannah Arendt. Arendt, a Jew who fled Germany during Adolf Hitler's rise to power, reported on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, for the New Yorker. A revised and enlarged edition was published in 1964. See, back to the text, see Bruno Bettelheim, The Informed Heart. I'm not really finding any good descriptions for this. It says, in 1938 to 39, Bruno Bettelheim was imprisoned in the concentration camps of Dachau and Buchenwald. In order to keep alive and remain human, Bruno Bettelheim began to analyze his own behavior and that of everyone around him. This book is a record of those years. Back to the text. It is hardly accidental that these books are themselves theoretically related. Elkin's book leans heavily on the essay that was later incorporated into The Informed Heart. Bettelheim's individualism and mass behavior in extreme situations. End footnote. Footnote. See the survey of the literature on the, quote, integration of the working class in John H. Goldthorpe, D. Lockwood, F. Beckhofer, and J. Platt's The Affluent Worker in The Class Structure. I'll look that book up. This book says, this final book in the Affluent Worker series was originally published in 1969. It contains the findings and conclusions on the issues the research was specifically designed to investigate, the extent of working class embourgeoisement. This thesis is examined in several contexts of work, sociability, social aspirations, and imagery, and so on. At all these points, it is called into question empirically and conceptually. In this volume, which brings the project to an end, the authors also take up again the broad questions of class and politics out of which the investigation originally sprang. Back to the text, end footnote. These works of Elkins, Bettelheim, and Arendt marked one swing of the pendulum. In more recent years, historical studies have moved in the opposite direction and stressed the form of resistance by slaves, Jews, and the working class. Footnote. For an outsider, it is necessary to be intrepid to wade into the vast and passionate debate on slavery. Elkins and Franz Tannenbaum has been attacked for years, and this is partly due to the utilization or misutilization of Elkins by the Moynihan Report. Wikipedia says, the Negro Family, the Case for National Action, commonly known as the Moynihan Report, was a 1965 report on black poverty in the United States, written by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, an American scholar serving as Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Lyndon B. Johnson, and later to become a U.S. Senator. Moynihan argued that the rise in black single-mother families was caused not by a lack of jobs, but by a destructive vein in ghetto culture, which could be traced to slavery times and continued discrimination in the American South under Jim Crow. Black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier had introduced that idea in the 1930s, but Moynihan was considered one of the first academicians to defy conventional social science wisdom about the structure of poverty. As he later wrote, quote, the work began in the most orthodox setting, the U.S. Labor Department, to establish at some level of statistical conciseness what, quote, everyone knew, end quote. The economic conditions determined social conditions, whereupon it turned out that what everyone knew was evidently not so, end quote. The report concluded that the high rate of families headed by single mothers would greatly hinder progress of blacks towards economic and political equality. The Moynihan Report was criticized by liberals at the time of publication, and its conclusions remained controversial. That's the Moynihan Report, and now this book that's being referenced, The Moynihan Report and the Politics of Controversy by Lee Rainwater and William L. Yancey. The Moynihan Report and the Politics of Controversy was written by Lee Rainwater and William L. Nancy and published with MIT Press. And the description of the book says, in March of 1965, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then Assistant Secretary of Labor, wrote a report on the condition of the American Negro entitled The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, otherwise known as the Moynihan Report. It gave voice to views that Moynihan had been considering for over a year and reflected his belief that policy making in the government should make greater use of the social sciences for problem diagnosis and description. This book is an inquiry into the political stir caused by the appearance of the Moynihan Report. The authors begin with two observations. First, the content of the report was neither new nor startling, and second, it was instantly the focus of intense political debate, with presidential endorsement on one hand and important administration and academic objection on the other. How does, quote, nothing new, end quote, generate such heat? The Moynihan Report and the Politics of Controversy deals with the complexities of formulating national policy on our most sensitive domestic issues and with what can happen to social science information as it makes its way through the political system. The Moynihan Report signaled a change in governmental thinking on the civil rights movement, shifting the emphasis from law to living conditions. Moynihan's central point, the absence of a strong male figure in the Negro family and the consequent loss in family stability, was an outgrowth of considerable accumulated social science research dating from as long as 30 years ago. The authors view the report as a political stimulus that provides an opportunity to examine both the complexity of controversy and the political context in which it appears. They rely primarily on face-to-face interviews with the principal participants in the controversy, with the additional aid of an extensive file of press clippings and their own experiences in the events described. After giving an introductory examination of the problem, the authors consider the political situation at the time the report was submitted and the intricate composition of current political attitudes on the civil rights movement. Moynihan's strategy and the report itself are then treated, followed by discussions of reactions to the report in the government and in the press, and finally the apotheosis of the controversy and the publicity about it. The report itself is included, as well as the documents pertaining to the controversy. Back to the text. Inasmuch as, back to this is still the footnote, inasmuch as blacks or the black family were seen as passive victims, the rejoinders emphasized the element of resistance and autonomous culture. See The Debate Over Slavery, Stanley Elkins and His Critics, edited by Anne J. Lane. I don't think I'm seeing any kind of description of that book. See Herbert G. Gutman's Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925. An exhaustively researched history of black families in America from the days of slavery until just after the Civil War. Okay. Back to the text. Herbert G. Gutman's Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925, published in 1977, takes as its point of departure the Moynihan Report and is an effective reply, arguing on behalf of a distinct black culture. On these grounds, Gutman criticizes Eugene Genovese's Roll Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made. published in 1975 for slighting a slave culture. The description for Roll Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made by Eugene D. Genovese was published by Vintage Books in 1976. The description says, "This landmark history of slavery in the South, a winner of the Bancroft Prize, challenged conventional views of slaves by illuminating the many forms of resistance to dehumanization that developed in slave society. Rather than emphasizing the cruelty and degradation of slavery, historian Eugene Genovese investigates the ways that slaves forced their owners to acknowledge their humanity through culture, music, and religion. Not merely passive victims, the slaves in this account actively engaged with the paternalism of slaveholding culture in ways that supported their self-respect and aspirations for freedom." Roll Jordan Roll covers a vast range of subjects, from slave weddings and funerals to the language, food, clothing, and labor of slaves, and places particular emphasis on religion as both a major battleground for psychological control and a paradoxical source of spiritual strength. Displaying keen insight into the minds of both slaves and slaveholders, Roll Jordan Roll is a testament to the power of the human spirit under conditions of extreme oppression. Back to the text. Whether Genovese represents or is made to represent an opposite position remains a question. Two thoughtful and contrasting discussions of Gutman's book are by George Rawik and Evelyn Brooks Barnett in a piece titled Symposium on Herbert Gutman's The Black Family in Radical History Review, published in 1977. See also George P. Rawik, From Sundown to Sunup. The description for that book says, what does it say? From Sundown to Sunup, The Making of the Black Community by George P. Rawik is published with Bloomsbury, and it says, George Rawik's From Sunup to Sundown is by far the most successful recent book about slave culture, ... As impressive as Rawik's analysis of slave life and his interpretation of American racism. That's from that description's from Eric Foner in a university review. Back to the text. One final note here. Elkins is far from dead and finished. His The Two Arguments on Slavery, published in 1975, included in the third edition of Slavery, is to the point. End footnote. Footnote. See Reuben Einstein, Jewish Resistance in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book. C. Reuben Einstein, Jewish Resistance in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, published in 1974. See Jacob Robinson and The Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, The Eichmann Trial, The Jewish Catastrophe, and Hannah Arendt's Narrative. Not seeing any kind of descriptions on that. Yeah, I'm not seeing any descriptions on And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight, the Eichmann Trial, the Jewish Catastrophe, and Hannah Arendt's narrative. Back to the text. See Terence de Price's An Anatomy of the Life in the Death Camps, published in 1970. Terence de Price's, it says Terence de Press actually. Terence de Press's The Survivor, An Anatomy of Life in the Death Camps is currently published by Oxford University Press. And it says, an eloquent revelation that touches the foundations of what man is. The Survivor, the book, describes the most terrible events in human memory. What emerges finally is an image of man stubbornly equal to the worst that can happen. It's not a very good description. I'm going to read the Google book's description. An eloquent revelation that touches the foundation of what man is, neither despairing nor conventionally hopeful. The Survivor describes the most terrible events in human memory, but what emerges finally is an image of man stubbornly equal to the worst that can happen. Where am I? Back to the text, end footnote. Footnote. See the fundamental work which has inspired many others and lesser ones is E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. End footnote. Everyone knows that book, so I'm not going to look that up. If more just, this perspective begins to shade into a mythic vision of resistance and progress. At this point, it raises more questions than it answers. The image of success and victories vies with the actual defeats and setbacks. If, for instance, the working class were progressing in their culture, struggles, and class consciousness, their defeat or relative passivity becomes not more, but less understandable. If the structure and success of domination is omitted in the name of the dominated, the veil of history darkens. Quote, a history from above, end quote, of the machinery of class domination is thus no less essential than a, quote, history from below, end quote. Indeed, without it, the latter in the end becomes one-sided, if the better side, end quote. Who said that? Perry Anderson, Lineages of the Absolutist State. For those who imagine that dialectics requires matching mathematical opposites, no problem exists. On one hand, there is domination, on the other, resistance. Marcuse's one-dimensional man was regularly derided as undialectical. Marcuse forgot that society was two-dimensional. Domination always incites resistance. This is the official Marxist interpretation of everything, or the power of positive thinking for Marxists. Any suggestion of the victory of state or bourgeois culture is countered by stressing the victory of the working classes and its culture. Each negative statement is answered by a positive. The total, however, is zero. This mathematical interpretation of history issues into a picture of forces of liberation battling the forces of domination. If this is adequate for actual warfare, it fails as a model for the existence and persistence of capitalism. Capitalism does not simply rely on perpetual military subjugation. For this reason, too, any blank juxtaposition of, quote, history from above and, quote, history from below threatens to conclude in two-volume works with few transitions. The crucial question is the relationship between these two histories. The official proletarian culture of the Third International, and most recently China, only portrays smiling, working, and powerful peasants. Frowns, sickness, betrayals, defeats were eschewed. Andrei Zhdanov, proponent of socialist realism, explained why optimism and heroism were the guiding slogans. Quote, our Soviet literature is impregnated with enthusiasm and the spirit of heroic deeds. It is optimistic because it is the literature of the rising class of the proletariat. ... End quote. Zhdanov. Footnote. Andrei Zhdanov, Problems of Soviet Literature, Reports and Speeches at the First Soviet Writers' Congress, 1934. Where am I? I'm not seeing any descriptions for that book. Yeah. Another proponent stated that socialist realism, quote, not only criticizes, it affirms, end quote. Cited in and see Kenneth E. Harper, Controversy in Soviet Literary Criticism on the Doctrine of Socialist Realism.
Tom?
Yeah.
You want to lick the bowl in the batter thing?
You're goddamn right I do.
Eater?
Yeah, I'll be out in a second. But my father's making cookies, and I'm going to eat the raw cookie dough. So if you don't hear from me again, it's because I died from the raw eggs. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for that book either. Oh, it was an unpublished PhD dissertation, so that's why. And also see Edward J. Brown's The Proletarian Episode in Russian Literature, 1928 to 1932. I'm not seeing any descriptions for this book either. All right. And finally, see Herman Ermolaev, Soviet Literary Theories, 1917 to 1934, The Genesis of Socialist Realism. Not seeing any descriptions for this book. Yeah, that's a shame. It's a shame to think that all these books are kind of like forgotten, just kind of in these footnotes, and like don't even have like a tombstone to say what they were about, you know? That's kind of sad. Anyone think that's kind of sad? I think it's kind of sad. Anyway, end footnote. This is the logic of orthodox Marxism and the hidden logic of much of the recent historical studies. The urge to stress the victories of the oppressed is deep-seated and humanistic. It ill serves its subject when the object defeats and surrenders. Political and psychological are whitewashed and go unrecognized, uncomprehended. Yet let there be no misunderstanding. The vision of unresisting victims by the social worker or the philanthropist is no better. This is a static view of history or the administrative dream of the world. Yet the application of the quote dialectical scheme, which decays into a behavioral psychology, must also be avoided. Stimulus provokes a response, or repression yields rebellion. Both visions corrode into myths.